Love that. All right. Well, I'm going to, well, first I'm gonna get rid of my Outlook so that doesn't happen. Okay, so I want to give a brief introduction and then we'll get started today with our workshop. So today's date, just because I think it's important to remember like where we're at any given time, especially for recorded workshops, is December 8th, 2021. My name is Sarah Milligan. I'm a member and the chair for the Education Committee of the Oklahoma Archivists Association. And you are in the OAA-sponsored Introduction to Scanning workshop today. We're going to focus on the basics of scanning, different types of materials, such as loose prints, booklets, films, and other objects, and just a general overview. This is a program of the Oklahoma Archivists Association, which is an organization to promote networking and education for archives professionals, students, and record keepers in the state of Oklahoma. This series is sponsored, or this workshop is sponsored by the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and the Oklahoma Historic Records Advisory Board, which has funding from the National Historic Publications and Records Commission. So we are recording today's workshop for sharing later on in the OAA website. The other thing is you can see past recorded webinars and virtual workshops on the OAA website under the resources tab. So for example, we just concluded a 6-part session on Archiving 101 foundational archives topics. So all of those are up and you can go back and revisit. And that was a really excellent series of workshops. So now I want to introduce our speaker for today's session. Stuart Rochefort is the studio manager at Florida State University Libraries and the Digital Library Center. Has worked with the Stozier Library since 2011, holds a BFA and an emphasis on photography and graphic design. So no wonder you know about scanning and digital imaging, and an MLIS degree from FSU. So Stuart's worked as a professional photographer, graphic designer, before joining FSU Libraries, and his team in the Digital Library Centers mainly digitizes material from the library's Special Collections Department, but also works in collaborations with other departments and researchers, which as archivists, we love collaborations. So Stuart, I'm going to pass this over to you, and thank you all so much for joining in today.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah and OAA and everyone involved for having me. And thanks you all for joining. I know everybody's really busy, so I appreciate you all taking the time to check out a webinar on training and scanning and imaging and that sort of thing. So I'm just gonna try and share my screen here for a second, so bear with me. We'll switch over to this one and we'll turn this into presenter view. And does that look all right to everyone? All right, cool, there we go. All right, I'm just gonna fix a few things here. All right, okay, so, right, there we go, introduction to scanning. Let's get right into it since we don't have too much time and we have a lot of topics to discuss. So I'm just gonna try and go through as much as possible. We'll have some time at the end for questions as well. And I would like to start off by saying there is a lot to cover, and I'm probably not going to be able to cover everything. So I would gladly respond to anyone's emails. If y'all want to get in touch personally, y'all can reach out to me. My contact information will be here and at the final slide as well. If y'all have specific questions that you think might warrant a longer discussion, I'd be happy to chat with anyone. So please get in touch after this and we can talk more. So there's my brief introduction again. I'm not going to go over too much because we don't have too much time, but I will talk a little bit about our studio setup and what kind of equipment we use in our studio. We have a few flatbed scanners, mostly Epson 12,000 XLs, and we have an Adhesive Book Drive Pro, which is specifically built to handle book scanning. And we have a Phase 1 IQ180 medium format overhead camera setup, which helps with handling most of our oversized material. We have a couple of document scanners as well, but those are mainly used for in-house paperwork, HR stuff, nothing that we would ever run our archival material through. And we'll go over all this in just a little bit. So briefly, just one quick definition of digitization is just to create a digital image from a physical object. That's one way to look at it. And while doing so, we want to aim to create a faithful representation of the original object Basically, we don't want to edit, colorize, do too many crazy things to these images before being displayed to the public. We want our patrons and researchers to see the material as if they were in our archives, taking a look at it themselves. So with most things, there's benefits and drawbacks, and there's going to be a few of these slides where we talk about the pros and cons of different pieces of software and equipment. In this case, overall benefits of digitization is one of them is that we can reduce the overall wear and tear of original objects. Less hands on the material can be a good thing when we want to preserve the actual original object. We want our patrons and researchers to get a tactile experience, but it does take a toll on our more fragile collections. So another benefit is that it increases accessibility when shared electronically, whereas someone might not be able to make it into whichever institution or archive you have. We can share these things more readily now with a wider audience, which I think is a great thing. They can also be used to perform advanced imaging forensics, infrared, multispectral, all sorts of advanced imaging. You can do all sorts of lighting, editing to see some details that you might not be able to see with your naked eye. So that's another cool thing about digitization. Some of the drawbacks is that we run into potential incompatibility issues with software and file formats. Just the nature of technology, it's changing so fast, it's hard to keep a standard in place for long. So it's a potential drawback that if you scan something in a specific file format, it might not work in a machine later on down the line. But I don't think we have to worry about that for a while. I think we're pretty good with our current file formats. So another drawback is researchers don't get that tactile experience that we talked about. So if we are sharing them just electronically, the users aren't able to come in and feel the paper, analyze the binding of a book, for example. Storage limitations, digital and physical, those are always going to be an issue, and those all come with the costs problems as well. All these things cost money, and that's something that we don't have too much of. It seems like budgets are shrinking every year, so that's another drawback of it. Different types of scanners. We are going to talk about a couple of them. We're going to focus primarily on flatbed scanners and the camera systems. Book scanners also fall under a camera system typically. Document scanners, film slide scanners, we're not going to talk too much about those. Those are more specialized pieces of equipment. They do have their place in certain institutions and studios, but we're going to talk mainly about the two main systems that we use. Flatbed scanners. Let's go right into this one. So these are very good for producing high resolution images without too much of technical ability and technical experience with imaging editing or processing. These are good for setting up maybe an OPS or part-time worker with some projects. They can scan quickly, just basically a few clicks of a button, and you'll have some pretty good images. We can also use these for small flat objects. They get really good resolution by digitizing small flat objects on a flatbed. They're really easy, just put them on the flatbed, close the lid, press scan, and you've got a pretty good image there. They can also be used to scan film and negatives and slides, transparencies, any sort of thing like that where light shines through. You can scan those on some flatbeds as well, which can be a benefit, depending especially if you have a wide variety of material in your archives, in your department. It helps to have these. They can get a lot of different types of work done. They're also very low maintenance and pretty easy to use, like we mentioned. You can set anybody up really quickly with these images. This over here, the image is just an Epson expression 10,000 XL. I think we still have one of those in our digital library center, and it gets a lot of use. I recommend getting some of these for your studio if possible. They also are very, very slow at production. If you put an image down and you want to scan it at a high resolution, it will probably crawl and take a couple of minutes at least to finish scanning. So that's something to keep an eye out for. They can also damage books. We don't typically recommend scanning books on these types of material, these equipment, but it can be done in a pinch, especially if the binding isn't at risk of being damaged. You can digitize books or booklets, pamphlets, that sort of thing on flatbed scanners as well. And we could take a quick look at some book scanners, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about these later on, but I wanted to start with just an overview of different types of equipment and software. So We looked at flatbed scanners. Now we can take a quick look at book scanners. The image on the right is our actual Book Drive Pro by Adhesive. We use this in our studio to digitize books primarily. We have a large book collection, a rare book collection in our department. So this one gets a lot of use, and it really helps take care of the fragile material that we have in our archives. The benefits of using a dedicated book scanner for digitizing books is that they are very gentle on fragile bindings. They can also do a really good job of keeping the pages flat, whereas if you didn't have any kind of glass to flatten them, you might not get the best images from that scanning. They also have adjustable arms, so you can capture large, small, different sizes of books, depending on the maximum size that the book scanner can handle. You can have some flexibility with different types of material. And they also allow for a very quick capture of images. You can typically tether these machines by connecting them to the computer directly, so that whenever you take a picture, it is directly transferred to the folder that you specify at the beginning of the project. That's typically our workflow with these kinds of projects, is tell it where you want the images to go, take a picture, and you have left and right individual images neatly stored in your folder for processing later on. They also have a lot of DIY options available. You can buy a fancy kit like this, the Adhesive Book Drive Pro, or anything by Digital Transitions. They have some pretty fancy book scanners, and they do a great job. But as I mentioned earlier, budget is not always what we want it to be. So you can build a really basic setup for low cost, and we can take a look at a couple of examples later. But yeah, all you need is really a camera, a light source, and the material, and you can get a lot of digitizing done that way. Some of the drawbacks of a book scanner, a dedicated book scanning station, is that they can be very expensive depending on the one that you get. If you're not building it, doing your own DIY setup, you can spend a lot of money buying one that's pre-built from any of those larger companies. They do have a larger footprint in general, since they do need a pretty wide platform depending on the size of material that you're digitizing. If you're doing oversized books, they will typically take up quite a lot of space. They also are a little bit more complicated than flatbed scanners. They have a little bit more of a complex learning curve, but once you get set up, you can get digitizing right away, and you can do it at a pretty fast rate. All right, so reprographic camera systems is a little different than book scanners. These are typically overhead cameras with a platform underneath, and the camera points down and it shoots at the image to get a high resolution image from the material. And on the right, there is the Phase 1 IQ and ADA. It's an overhead camera setup that we use in our Digital Library Center at Florida State University Libraries. And it can be used, we use it primarily for digitizing oversized material, any kind of books that are too large to fit on our book scanner, and just a wide assortment of material. These things can handle a lot of stuff, and they can get pretty high resolution. So some of the pros are, yes, high resolution images. They also can be very fast capture. We don't have to wait for the scanner to finish. As soon as you click the button, you have your image right away. So it's instant transfer. You can handle oversized objects. They have adjustable height, so you can zoom in, zoom out. If you have on some lenses, interchangeable lenses, you can switch those out for more customizability. And they also provide you with some even lighting source, since you can set up the lights to cover left and right, all different angles. You can digitize all sorts of material as well, not only reflective material like objects, books and manuscript material, but you can do transparencies and film and slides if you have a light box and a macro lens. So reprographic camera systems can handle a lot of material. These also tend to be very expensive if you're not building your own DIY kit, which you can easily do with, there's a lot of plans out there online. And I think I provided a couple of links at the end if y'all want to try building your own. Yeah, they have a very large footprint as well, and pretty complex learning curve. So, and here's just a couple more images of our reprographic camera system, our IQ180 in the Digital Library Center, is just showing two different types of material that we work with. On the left, we have just an old map of Trinidad and Tobago, and the camera is zoomed all the way in to get a pretty high resolution scan of it. And then on the right side, we have an oversized book, which was too large for any of our other equipment. So we just pointed the camera straight down at it and took a picture one side at a time. So we would just do the right side of the book and flip it around, do the left side, and then combine all of those images into one folder, and we have a nice book representation. So you can do lots of stuff with reprographic systems. And here's just a few examples of the range of, I guess, types of scanners, book scanners you can get. You can buy one, Venture, CopyMate, those ones, they're not too expensive. That's one of the lower end, more consumer models, and I forget the exact cost on it. It's been a while since we looked into these, but they do a really good job. You basically mount your own camera onto it, whichever DSLR, even if it's a point and shoot, they all have a little screw base there, and you can move this thing up and down to zoom in or out if you don't have a telephoto lens or zoom lens. They also come with light sources on the left and right, but of course you can provide your own light source. The DIY copy stand in the middle there is a good example of just a basic setup. You could even do it cheaper if you use PVC pipe or something, but it just goes to show that you can get images done without a huge budget. That's kind of what I wanted to get across. There is a wide range of setups that you can get. Right, so we looked at the types of equipment, and let's take a look at some of the material types that we typically face. We mainly work with reflective and transmissive material. The difference between that is just the light is shining through an object in transmissive material, or it's bouncing off the object in reflective material. That light is hitting the sensor, whether or not it's on a flatbed sensor or a camera sensor. The light goes to that image sensor, and that tells the computer what the image should look like, basically. So reflective materials, anything printed, so newspapers, books, manuscripts, artifacts, 3D material, anything like that is going to be reflective material. And then our transmissive set is film, slides, negative, transparencies, anything along those lines. And you can handle that with dedicated film scanners, or you can do it with an Epson flatbed scanner, or any Canon makes a few of them as well. If you do have a light box and a macro lens, you can do it with photography as well. You can digitize film and negatives that way. So there's lots of different options. We just looked at some material types, and we can talk briefly about some file types, since this is something that we deal with daily, and it's important to know the difference between them all. TIFF is what we recommend, and that's what we use in our institution. Those are an archival file format. We are not losing any of our image quality by editing these or cropping, saving. It is a lossless compression file format. That it is a pretty large file size, but we want to ensure that our researchers are getting the best image possible. And with JPEGs or other file formats, you can run into some pixelation if we end up doing any kind of editing or saving, cropping images. You can start to lose image quality every time you save it, just due to the way that those files are compressed. And because those other file formats do have lossy compression, they are a much smaller file size. So that's a benefit. JPEGs are fine for sending out to patrons and researchers. They're small enough that you can email them. If anybody just wants to read a list of names on a manuscript, for example, it's fine. But for anything that's due for publication or printing at a large size, TIFF is usually recommended if you can. JPEG 2000 has its place. A lot of online repositories will use JPEG 2000 to display high resolution images at a smaller file size. It helps with quick loading. But as far as saving files as JPEG 2000s, that's not something that we typically do these days. There are softwares that support JPEG 2000s, but a lot of those pieces of software have kind of phased out support for JPEG 2000. It does exist and it does have its place, but it's not the most widely supported file format. So I would just use caution when using JPEG 2000s in your files, and I would recommend just using TIFFs or PDFs are a good one. Those are good for combining multiple images into multi-page documents, as opposed to just single documents. Books work well in PDF formats. Just any kind of multi-page document can be saved as PDF. They can also be compressed in different ways. You can use a high resolution compression, or you can shrink them down to reduce the file quality and the file size if needed. They also have the benefit of incorporating OCR, optical character recognition, which is extremely helpful for creating transcripts of typed material. It can be done on some handwritten material, but the technology isn't quite there to be as accurate as we would like. So OCR is a really good benefit from PDF files. Bitmaps, BMP, I do not recommend those. That's an older file format. I think they might still be around, but if you have bitmap files, or if you're saving bitmaps for high resolution images, I don't recommend it, and maybe look into finding a different type of file for those. Now, I'll quickly talk about raw files. These are mainly from camera systems. They are either going to be .nef, .cr2, IIQ. Each camera company seems to have their own proprietary raw file format, but those are good to keep on file if you have the storage space, because those raw files contain exactly that, all of the raw data before it is converted into the final image. So you can go back and do a lot of edits to raw files without losing a lot of image data. So yeah, file types. I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. So resolution, quickly, there's two different ways to describe resolution. You've probably heard both, DPI, PPI. They used to mean two different things, but they've since kind of been merged, and they can be used interchangeably. PPI is typically what we're talking about when we're talking about resolution. That's pixels per inch, and that's the actual size of the image. Dots per inch is mainly used in printing situations. So that's the output printing resolution, DPI, how many dots of ink are going to be squeezed into 1 inch. Basically, it's a different way of looking at the same kind of concept. Most images, we typically recommend scanning at 400 pixels per inch. Of course, that is not set in stone. Every institution will be different, and even the equipment will have its own limitations. And yeah, it's just a guide. 400 PPI that's what was recommended by the FADG guidelines, the Federal Imaging Guidelines, and that's typically what we try to follow as closely as possible. I have a link to the FADG guidelines, FADGI, Federal. I'm not going to try to remember what the acronym is, but it's at the end there. And 4,000 pixels on the long edge of your file is a good goal, depending on, of course, the size of the material you're working with and the limitations of your software. 4,000 pixels typically, in most cases, will give you enough resolution to do what you need it to. And we don't meet that standard often because we have our own technological limitations, and images and the material we work with is pretty small sometimes, so we're not able to make that 4,000 pixels, but it is just a goal, a guideline. There's also a quick little formula down there. If you are looking to determine the pixel count, you can do a little equation, just do the physical dimensions of the object multiplied by the pixels per inch that you're scanning at, and then you'll find out how many pixels your end result will be. So an 8x10 image, for example, scanned at 400 PPI will end up at about 3,200 by 4,000 pixels. That could also be used in reverse. You can divide it if you know the size of your objects and you need to find out the minimum acceptable pixels. You can use that formula to kind of enter in the accurate PPI. All right, quick thing about pixels. Most of you all probably already know this, but we have different, we have high res and low res images, and I'm sure you all have encountered these in your field. So yeah, the short of it is more pixels equals higher resolution, and less pixels typically means lower resolution. And we want to aim for high res when possible, when we are trying to display the original objects as best as possible. Low res, you can see it's clearly pixelated, and that's fine for a lot of stuff if we need to keep the file size down, and if you just need to share a reference copy with anyone, low res is fine. But when we are sharing these at an institutional repository or a digital library, we want to try and get as high resolution as possible. And something that goes into this as well is color modes. I want to discuss these real quick because any scanning software or image editing software is going to ask you what color mode you would like your images to be displayed in. And we have color, grayscale, and black and white. Those are the three main color modes. Everything that we do in the DLC at our studio is going to be in color because we can always create a grayscale or a black and white derivative from that image, but we can never recreate the color. So if we scan something in grayscale or black and white directly, there's no going back from that. So we always recommend scanning in color. Of course, it really depends, like everything that we're talking about here. We can get the most detail out of those. They can be turned into grayscale and black and white later, but they do increase the file size because they do have a lot more image data in them. Grayscale is kind of in between there. It includes all the different shades of gray in between, while leaving out the color detail. So you'll still be able to tell the texture of a paper, for example, whereas if you scan something in black and white, you're only going to get two tones, black and white, so you lose everything in between there. If anything is kind of a light gray, it's probably going to be lost when you convert something to black and white. So that's fine for typed documents or anything that has clear text in it. That's totally fine. Right. So let's see an example of some of these color modes. We have the three different ones here represented with a piece of ostraca from our collections. This is a really old item. It's a little artifact that we digitize with our IQ and 8 from overhead. And we digitize it in color mode, 24-bit color. And we just wanted to show the examples of what happens when you convert those images either to grayscale or to black and white. And you can see there's an obvious difference in quality and image data. But also at the bottom, you'll note that the file size is considerably larger for the color image and goes down after that. So if file size is a priority, then you can consider black and white or gray, but we want to aim for color when possible. All right, speaking of color, accurate color is important, especially if we do not have good control of the lighting conditions, or if we are working with an uncalibrated system with either your monitors or graphics cards, or your cameras might not be calibrated. These can help get accurate colors. This is a QP card. You can purchase these relatively inexpensively from online, and you can just print them out and use them in your scans. It's good to have a reference point. So once you scan an image, you typically would include a QP card or any kind of target in your image. And you can use your software, Photoshop or any other piece of software, to point to that individual gray swatch, and it will typically correct the color so that you'll get the most accurate image as possible. Another thing to help with color is room treatment. This is more important for photographic situations where we don't have as much control of the light, but having a studio that has painted walls, usually a gray neutral color and non-reflective paint is important so that we don't have all kind of wild colors bouncing off the walls onto our images. That also goes for clothes. The clothes that you wear, if you're wearing a bright pink or yellow shirt for example, that can end up on your image later on if the light is bouncing off your shirt and onto the image. So it helps to have a target so that you can correct for those variables. And with film scanning, it helps with some subjective adjustments, because film is a little bit different than a printing product, because there could be some post-processing done later on that we kind of have to determine how they want the image to look. So having a gray cue card can help get some accurate results with that. All right, some quick things to look out for when scanning or digitizing material. Staples, those are a problem, especially with flatbed scanners. If we are digitizing anything that has staples in them, they can and will scratch the glass when you close that lid. So it's important to either remove the staples before digitizing, or just be as careful as possible when putting the object on the glass or removing it. Because a scratch will definitely show up on your image, especially when you're scanning at high resolutions. So we want to watch out for those. Adhesive is also something to look out for. Any kind of residue from tape or any kind of glue that might have been on a piece of paper from a scrapbook, for example, that can leave residue on the glass, which can either affect the next object that you're digitizing, or it can leave a smudge on the glass. So it's good to just try and clean in between each session just to make sure that there's no residue or anything like that on these scans. Closing the lid is also important. If you are scanning anything with depth, maybe a thicker booklet, for example, those might prevent the flatbed lid from closing, and that can introduce some unwanted light. And it's good to potentially put a cloak or a piece of fabric, opaque fabric, over the hood in that case, so that no external light gets into the scan. Also, keeping it steady is important. We want to make sure that we're not bumping into the table while a high resolution scan is going. These things can take minutes, so any kind of bump can negatively affect the image quality. So we want to try and keep it as steady as possible. Other things to look out for. When digitizing books, we just need to be careful that we're not destroying the binding, especially if we are considering scanning a book on a flatbed scanner. We just need to be super cautious about how it's going and the fragility of the material. Just consider that before scanning. If it sounds like the binding and the strings are starting to pop when you put it on the flatbed, it's probably time to take a break from it and maybe find something else to scan on there. The gutters can be dark. We can resolve that by adjusting the lighting when digitizing books. And with film, it's important to make sure that the film is facing the right way. Once you put the film down on the flatbed, it can be hard to determine which way it was actually meant to be displayed. So looking for any kind of logos on maybe a shirt or a print from a film scan can help you orient the image correctly. By zooming in on a logo, you can flip it to get the right direction. Yeah, you can check for text. More patterns. On the image on the right, you can see an example of what happens when you scan a halftone pattern at a certain resolution. If the resolution doesn't match with the halftone pattern, you can get these effects on your image. They can be avoided sometimes just by zooming out or adjusting the resolution. Sometimes that takes care of it. Other times you might have to get more creative in post-production. But you can Google that for more information. That more effect is it does happen, especially when digitizing reflective material. All right. So another thing to look out for, those two images on the side there, those are two different images from our equipment in our studio. One of them had a bad sensor and the other one did not. The one on the right, I don't know if you all can see it with this resolution here, but there is definitely some unwanted artifacts happening in this image. This was just due to the sensor failing, and once we replaced it, we were left with a much better scan of the same page. So when you're seeing horizontal or vertical lines going throughout the entire image, that typically is a sign of a sensor that might be failing. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. And they can be purple or green lines, and that's an indication that it is a sensor that might be on its way out. Some more things to look out for. This is more about post-production, but it also is important to consider this when digitizing the material. We want to make sure that we have a straight image if possible. We have a before and after image on the right there showing what the original looked like and then what the cropped version looked like. We straightened and cropped it so that it would be more presentable to our users. Not only does it make it more visually appealing, but it can also help with more accurate OCR results. If the text that you're scanning is crooked, then OCR software is going to have a hard time getting a good transcript from it. So getting it as straight as possible is always recommended. It's not always possible. Some pages are folded, printed incorrectly as well, so they could be all over the place, but when possible, try to get it as straight as you can. And that's, skewing it and also getting an even margin around the edges, I think is good to make it more presentable. It can take more time in post-production, but the end result has something a little bit more standardized, and I think it helps. All right, focus check is also important. This is more important with photography work, since the nature of lenses lends itself to more problems with focus, whereas flatbed scanners are typically better at focusing, but these problems can present themselves in both scanning and photographic work. So I recommend always zooming in to the object all the way to 100% view before completing a project or starting a project, so that you know your focus is set, because you can't go through an entire project zoomed out and digitizing it thinking that it's in focus, but it turns out when you zoom in, it's actually pretty soft and you're losing a lot of detail. And we do include targets for that reason. We can include object level targets for an objective focal point. We can use these if we zoom in on that target, and if that's sharp, then that means our object is probably sharp as well. And these issues can be prevented by flattening the objects and trying to get the best image possible. All right, so some software. There is a ton of software out there, and as with most things, they have a range of costs, and you can get some super expensive advanced pieces of software, but you could also get some open source free pieces of software that do a really good job. There's different kinds. There's image and file management software like Adobe Bridge, file management and image editing. You can open the images, browse through an entire folder of images all at once to see them all in front of you. And from there, you can also edit your images in Photoshop. There are some standalone image editing programs which don't have the file management element. So Photoshop, GIMP, Scan, some of those are just strictly image editing. There's a ton of other ones, but those are some of the main ones. Image editing and file management, some of them contain both. So Adobe Lightroom does that, Capture One does a good job of that. We use Capture One primarily in our studio, and that does a really good job. It can get expensive with some of the more advanced versions of it, but it does a really good job with file management and image editing. And there are then some dedicated scanning pieces of software. So Epson Scan is what most Epson scanners use. They come with it and it's free, and it does a great job, has everything you need. Image Capture is the Mac free version. They will do a pretty good job as well. You don't have to install anything special. I think it comes installed by default with Macs, but if not, you can go and download it. Windows Scan is another free software. That one I don't really recommend unless that's all you have available. It'll do the job. View Scan and Silverfast are also pretty advanced scanning softwares that you can use. And here is just an example of typical scanning session in Epson Scan. On the left side of this image here, you will have all of your settings. You're going to tell it your resolution, what kind of image, is the color black and white, if it's reflective, transmissive. You're basically setting up the scan, and you will get a little preview over there. And from that preview, you can scan the final image. And that's how most scanning software works. It's pretty straightforward, and they all have varying levels of complexity. So it's good to keep that in mind. And I'm not going to go through this entire list, but there you can see the costs and what what operating systems can be used on. And editing software, Adobe Photoshop, Creative Cloud, there's Photoshop Elements, Capture One Pro, which we use. On the right side there is a image of a typical session in Capture One that we will use. We'll have our images of the books over here, our thumbnails, and then on the left side, we'll have the larger view so that we can zoom in and edit and do any kind of a more detailed cropping and editing. And Scan-Tailor, I recommend Scan-Tailor. That is an open source piece of software, but it's extremely powerful and it has a lot of different versions. It can be used on Mac and PC. I recommend y'all download that one. If you're looking for a piece of software, that's a good place to start for editing. It does a really good job for books as well, and a wide variety of material. So check out Scan-Tailor. All right, so quickly, we're going to go over some post-processing things to look out for. The post-processing can be very involved. We try to keep it to a minimum. We try to get everything done at the beginning when we take the actual image. But of course, there is inevitably some kind of post-processing that needs to be done, whether it's color correcting, cropping, rotating, sharpening, exporting, file naming, stitching. Yes, they can be time consuming if you're doing a lot of this work to your images, but sometimes it needs to be done, and we can take a look at it. So auto adjustments, we typically recommend against using any of the auto features in the scanning software. Autofocus is great, but a lot of the auto color, auto exposure, auto sharpness, that can present us with some undesirable results. This image on the left here is one that was edited with some auto exposure. It was scanned with auto exposure on, and the one on the right is scanned with auto exposure off. And you can see there's a vast difference between them. The one on the right does look a lot more like the original objects, which is our goal. The one on the left kind of looks a little bit cartoony, a little bit color, enhanced color saturation, which can be helpful when bringing out faded text. So it can be used. We just typically try not to do it unless we really need to. It can have some pretty bad results. Cropping, we talked about that a little while ago. Straightening and cropping is important, but also leaving a little bit of a margin around the objects is helpful, especially when digitizing pages like this from a manuscript or a diary. We don't want to end up with something like this where the text is cut off because it potentially is excluding a lot of valuable material that our researchers might want to see. And also, they don't know how much of it we cropped off. That thing could go on for another mile if we let it. So it's good to show the entire object. That gives a lot more context for our users, and I think that's very important. So file naming, we'll quickly talk about file naming. We're getting close to wrapping it up here, and we'll have some time for questions. And I, again, will be happy to talk about any more of this stuff in depth. So post-processing and file naming, that is important. We want to have some standards in place so that files aren't just ending up all over the place with different file names that have no meaning whatsoever. We, in the Digital Library Center at FSU, we will typically use these file naming conventions in our imaging guidelines, which I've included a link to at the end of this presentation, if you all want to check them out. The file names, typically, we want them to show the location of the original objects so that if somebody is only looking at an image, a single image in a folder that they downloaded a long time ago, they could track their way back down to the original. So if they want to find out more about the original object or read all the other pages in that book, they can find it back on the shelves. So showing the location of the original is helpful. I'll show an example of that after this slide. Being consistent is very important. Otherwise, all is lost and files can end up all over the place. We have no idea where they belong. So being consistent with your file naming helps a lot. And avoiding special characters is important. So we don't want any spaces or special characters. Those will be problematic when uploading them to a repository or sharing them electronically. Typically, when uploading them, those special characters get translated into some very strange looking IIDs, identifiers, and file names. So use underscores and dashes if you need to. Other than that, stick to numbers and characters, letters. And here's a quick example of our file naming conventions that we try to stick to when doing projects in our department. So we will differentiate between the collection types, whether it's a book or manuscript or university archive material. And our file names will either begin with just FSU or FSU MSS for manuscript collections and HUA for heritage and university archives. And in green down here, we have an example of each. So by looking at this, we can find out the call number for the book. So we can find it on the shelf if we need to, or a user might want to find the book on the shelf themselves. And the call number is right there. So it's easy to track down to the original. And same with the manuscript material. We have the collection number, the box number, box 24, and folder 2. And this is the first item in that set of material. So they know exactly where to go to find out more. And university archives is similar. This is an example from, I think, some negatives or some film. It has the date on it and the name of the binder and the individual image on there. So that will help make things easier. So we are coming up on time, and we went through this, all of this, that's great. Borrow from other institutions, that's an important note. It's no point creating your own guidelines from scratch. I highly recommend looking at other similar institutions, maybe even consulting with them before setting up your own guidelines. We borrowed from lots of different places when we created our own internal documentation, and I think that's a really good way to go about it. No need to reinvent the wheel, but of course they can be custom tailored to your needs. All right, so we got some resources there. I recommend checking them out. It's got a basic scanning guide for most situations, but then we have some more advanced and overarching guidelines. This final link at the bottom is a wealth of information for all different scanning situations, photography, scanning, all different aspects of it. And I recommend checking that out if you're looking to learn a lot more about this type of work. I also included our imaging guidelines and a link to our Digital Library Center if you want to find out more about our specific work and what we do, and just a few other guidelines that we borrowed from along the way. With that being said, thank you very much for having me and letting me talk for so long. And I would love to hear some questions. And if you don't have any right now, I would be happy to answer them in a lengthy email. We could also set up a Zoom call if you all would like. I would love to talk about this until I can talk no longer. So please get in touch if you all have any questions. And thank you very much. That's it for me. Thank you.
All right, Stuart, that was amazing. I was kind of like 45 minutes to succinctly explain digitization. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
You all are welcome to put questions in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask directly. Do you have any vendors you tend to work with for this type of equipment?
Yeah, that's a great question. We also ask that question a lot of other institutions. Yeah, we have a primary vendor that we stick with, and I recommend them because we've had nothing but good experiences with them. I'll enter it in the chat here, Digital Transitions. That's who we use for most of our equipment, and they also offer a lot of good consulting work. So yeah, we stick with them for any ideas that we are working on, or if we're looking to get some new equipment, we work with them. They're based up in New York, but they have locations all over the place. So yeah, and they also offer a lot of good training documentation, videos, webinars. Yeah, check them out, Digital Transitions. Thank you for that question.
Great. I'm wondering how many of you all attending this are already doing scanning, and how many of you all are just getting started with scanning in your own organizations. And Stuart, I might take you off your screen share.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, there we go.
Fine. That way I can see. Raise your hand if you are already scanning in your organization. You can raise your virtual hand or your list 1, 2. How many of you all are just getting started or thinking about getting started scanning material in your organization? More. Okay. I wondered, I figured there was a good blend. All right. All right, any more questions? We've been able to add a few things in the chat as Stuart was talking, just for reference points, and we'll definitely follow up with a link to this recording.
Yeah, I just saw those. Yeah, thank you for putting those links in there. That's really good information. Thank you for plugging those in there as the presentation was going. Yeah, all of those are great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not hearing any more information, which I think actually means that you did a really good job laying it out, and that people are going to have to put it into practice and then get back with more questions.
That's great. Yeah, and like I said before, I love talking about this, and I will be happy to chat with anyone if you all want to talk specifically about your institution and your projects. If you're just getting started, we could talk about some of those ideas and how to even get started. Or if you're doing some more advanced stuff, we could talk about that as well. But anyways, it's an open invitation. And if you find yourself in the Tallahassee area for some reason, please feel free to stop by the studio and check it out in action.
That's really kind. Okay, I'm going to stop recording at this point.
Okay.